So continuing in Domain 1, Security and Risk Management, we're going to talk about professional ethics and take a look at some of the professional ethics standards that exist that are covered as part of the CBK. We understand essentially what professional ethics are, right? The way that we should act in due care in relation to our professional position. Primarily as a information assurance officer or as a security professional, and in dealing with computers and computer technology. This has been around for quite some time, since computers were first conceived in the early 1900s from the very basic computing function. Norbert Wiener published a book called The Human Use of Human Beings, which included kind of concepts of professional ethics in the 1960s. Don Parker published the Rules of Ethics in Information Processing. Obviously, at those times, computers were not as prevalent and not as powerful as they are today. So you can see how it would be significantly more important to introduce ideas of computer ethics in the concept of, or in the context of, using computers in our daily lives and in our transactional lives with other individuals. Obviously, we've seen computers play a significant role in computer crime and cybercrime, providing a lot of options for criminals to utilize computing resources and computing power, to pretty much facilitate just about any crime that exists today has some sort of computing element to it. So there are ethical programs that exist. In fact, we're a Cisco Premier Partner, and every year we have to sign a document stating that we have enlisted within our organization as a professional company and as a Cisco partner an ethics training program, understanding the need for ethics programs in dealing with our clients, in dealing with our supply chain, making sure that we are operating in the best interest of not only Cisco, but our customers and so on. So a lot of professional organizations, a lot of companies have instilled or installed, I should say, these ethical programs as part of their kind of standard operating procedure. And understand that ethics are not just, it's not just, laws and regulations, abiding by, specific laws of, preventing fraud and waste or criminal waste or criminal fraud or whatever it might be. It's operating in a way that, in gray areas where, it may not necessarily be criminal activity, but it's also not necessarily the right type of activity, or it's not necessarily ethical activity. So just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean that it's prudent or necessarily ethical. So that is a consideration that we have to take into account when we're dealing with ethics. It's dealing in those gray areas where, yes, technically, I guess that's really not frowned. I mean, it's not documented as illegal, but it's probably not very ethical. The one example that comes to mind, if you guys are a Seinfeld aficionados or you love Seinfeld, you'll know that George Costanza decided to have relations with the cleaning staff woman in the office, and the boss found out and called him in the office and was kind of chastising him, and his response was, well, I didn't realize that was frowned upon. And it was, obviously a funny little skit, but it does speak to what we're talking about here, which is, no, there wasn't something specifically defined, but, is it really ethical or is it really prudent, to do something like that? So ethics programs require, within a business or a professional organization, require kind of a standard of due care beyond just following laws and regulations. You need to act in the best interest of the organization, act in the best interest of individuals, customers, etc. In 1991, the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines for organizations also defined minimal ethical requirements. And again, this is not necessarily defined for criminal activity because we have laws that protect from criminal activity. This is more for ethical activity that would open an organization up to potentially civil litigation or whatnot, or negligence, or at best, reputational damage because they're not operating in an ethical standards. Now, certainly there are some ethical boundaries that can be crossed, which would then take you into the realm of criminal activity, especially when it comes to cybercrime or fraud. But there are also those areas that aren't necessarily criminal activities, but they are, in fact, would be considered or deemed unethical in a modern society. So defined ethical standards, reduced penalties in criminal cases if the minimums were met. And that was that safe harbor concept that we talked about previously, where, okay, if you were effectively breaking a law, but you're operating in, under the guise of ethical standards, the penalties for that criminal activity might be reduced. Board members and organizational leaders have to be part of and compliant with ethical programs. This became particularly important because in the past, typically CXOs or board members or people that were maybe in a leadership position within an organization but were somewhat disconnected from the daily operations or the daily function of an organization would be separated from prosecution or separated from responsibility for the actions of their employees or of the parties involved with the organization. So they could claim, in essence, that they were not aware or they were not privy to what was happening within the organization at those levels. So they were excluded from, ridicule and prosecution based on that. But several different laws were passed that stopped that practice. That you just because you are a board member or just because you're the CEO doesn't mean that you shouldn't understand what's happening in your organization, and you shouldn't be responsible for the parties in your organization that are operating under your leadership. All right. So compliance and ethics programs include typically 3 subsections. What is the purpose of the program itself? Subsection B describes the 7 minimum requirements of the program. We don't specifically get into them, but they're pretty self-explanatory when you look at them. And then, of course, we have to have some sort of provision to periodically assess risks to the organization from an ethical standpoint and modify those 7 requirements as needed as businesses change, as the landscape changes within our business environment. All right? All right. So one of the more popular, or at least well-known components is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It's a U.S. law that essentially mandates certain practices for financial institutions. We talked a little bit about this in our previous section, but specifically it deals with financial record keeping and reporting for corporations. This came out in July 30th of 2002. It was called the Public Company Accounting Reform and Investor Protection Act, or the Corporate and Auditing Accountability, Responsibility, and Transparency Act. But now most people just simply call it SOX, or Sarbanes-Oxley, or Sarbox or SOX. Most people just simply refer to it as SOX. There's 11 sections in place, and all public company boards of directors, management, and public accounting firms have to adhere to these standards, and some private companies as well. Obviously, willful destruction of evidence to impede federal investigations would be illegal. There were a lot of different kind of major corporate and accounting scandals. I don't know if you guys recall Enron, WorldCom kind of triggered the need for this bill because of their accounting practices and unethical practices in accounting and so on. So the bill basically covers the responsibilities of a public corporation's board of directors. There are criminal penalties for specific misconduct. It also required that the Securities and Exchange Commission created regulations to define how public corporations are to comply with this particular law. And it kind of breaks down that those rules. We don't need to get into the specifics. You can see here it says that it contains 11 sections enacting that were enacted as a reaction to major corporate accounting scandals that cost investors billions of dollars. But it includes elements like a public company accounting oversight board, auditor independence rules, corporate responsibility, to society, essentially. It covers ethical financial disclosures, and conflicts. It talks about conflicts of interests, commission resources, different components of corporate and criminal fraud accountability, white-collar crime penalty enhancements, etc. Also deals a lot with corporate tax structures, what is corporate fraud accountability programs, and so on. So when it comes to the scope of the exam, you're not going to be required to understand the details of these particular acts. Obviously, they're very, very detailed and quite extensive. What you do need to know, though, is you need to know, kind of which acts might apply to what types of business or in relation to what function within a business. So you would need to know that SOX is essentially there to, to hold public company boards of directors and public accounting firms responsible for, financial fraud, tax fraud, etc. That's the kind of thing that they would ask you on the exam, not the specifics of the act itself. Here are the things that I had just listed off. A public company accounting oversight board, provide independent oversight of public accounting firms, providing auditing services for those public accounting firms, auditor independence, external auditor independence to limit conflicts of interests. In other words, you can't do your own internal audits to see if you're compliant with rules and regulations and laws. Corporate responsibility. Senior executives take individual responsibility for the accuracy and completeness of the corporate financial reports. That was always kind of something in the prior to this act. The CEO or chairman of the board or the board of directors could say, well, that was really just the accounting firm. They're the ones that did it incorrectly. We didn't really know, so we're not held to be held to account for these false tax forms that were filed on our behalf. They can no longer claim that. They have accountability. Enhanced financial disclosures, reporting requirements for financial transactions, including off-balance sheet transactions, pro forma figures, and stock transactions of corporate officers. Analyst conflicts of interest, measures designed to help restore investor confidence in the reporting of security analysts. Commission resources and authority. Defines practices to restore investor confidence in the securities analysts. Studies and reports. Requires a comptroller general. Requires a comptroller general and the SEC to perform studies and report findings on the corporation. Corporate and criminal fraud accountability describes specific criminal penalties for the manipulation, destruction, or alteration of financial records or other interference with investigations while providing certain protections for whistleblowers. White-collar crime penalty enhancement increases the criminal penalties associated with the white-collar crimes and conspiracies. And the last two, corporate tax returns, states the CEO should sign off on the company tax return. And corporate fraud accountability identifies corporate fraud and records tampering as criminal offenses and joins those offenses to specific penalties. So, again, you don't need to know all of those specifics, but SOX is definitely something that is a kind of a mainstream act that falls under the guise or under the category of operating in an ethical manner and holds to account the directors and the executives for doing so. All right. Computers in the workplace. We need to consider how computers impact health and job satisfaction, especially if it's a lot of repetition, a lot of workflow or work actions that are repeated on a continual basis. There was a big push in the 90s to design ergonomically into a computing environment or a computing workspace, comfort and whatnot, to make constant repetitive work on a computer more safe and more health conscious and so on. So that's one aspect of ethics that need to be addressed in a computing environment. Certainly computer crime, right? A lot of crimes committed today are now spearheaded with the use of computers and computing resources because they're cheap and fast and efficient and so on. Also dealing with information and data flow, privacy and anonymity. Okay. Okay, I can't say that word. I don't know why. Privacy and anonymity. The ability of computers to gather, store, search, compare, retrieve, share personal information needs to be addressed. And certainly that's really, really critical, right? In the past, medical records, as I mentioned in one of our previous sections, used to be stored in paper form, in a physical file in a filing cabinet locked in a room. Very easy to protect that information, very easy to ensure that that information is logged and tracked and who has access to that information and so on. But as soon as those records become electronic files, the ability to propagate that information, to copy that information, to move that information becomes much simpler. And also the ability to have multiple copies of that information becomes a lot easier. So we have to implement things like DLP solutions, data loss prevention or data leakage prevention solutions, and other authentication and authorization solutions to ensure that only the appropriate personnel have access to that information. Intellectual property, computer applications, computer works, anything that's created with a computer, application development, software development, not only in the realm of piracy and stealing software applications by modifying registration keys, etc., but using legitimate applications as a transport mechanism for illegitimate applications in the form of a Trojan or a drive-by download or something like that. So we have to be aware of that. Professional responsibility and globalization. The world is much smaller with cloud computing and business-to-business communications and so on. So we have to understand not only what our local, state, and federal laws are within our region, we have to understand and consider what the global laws are. How does information flow from one country to another, from one business to another? There are some companies, or some countries, I should say, we would deem as information rich. A lot of computing resources, a lot of computing power. They have easy access to information and data, which generally will give them more power, more knowledge. And we have information poor nations that don't necessarily have access to data. With this Ukraine-Russia thing, we saw Starlink, the Elon Musk company that provided internet access to the Ukrainian people because internet was blocked or destroyed, or the traditional terrestrial connections were destroyed. So that without access to the internet, without access to information on the internet, it can greatly reduce one's ability to even participate in society today. It's pretty significant. All right. So these are some of the quote-unquote falsehoods that are outlined in the CBK. Computer game falsehood. Computers prevent cheating and work with exact accuracy and correctly, meaning that computers will control what the user does with the idea that we're going to prevent cheating or we're going to work in an ethical manner. Computers are exacting. They do exactly what they're told to do for the most part. There are some bugs and computers can crash and whatnot, but generally a computer is not artificial intelligence. It's not making its own decision. It's doing whatever the program states it's going to do based on the inputs and the outputs of that particular program, but they're not infallible from operational errors, buffer overflows or memory allocation errors, whatever. And programs themselves will have errors either mistakenly or intentionally built into them that will cause them to operate incorrectly. All right. The law-abiding citizen falsehood. Laws define minimum standards for users. Users still have to consider their actions. And that was kind of what I was talking about previously. Just because something is, not considered illegal doesn't mean that it is ethical. You still have to act in due care, even though you're not crossing the threshold of breaking a law. You are potentially crossing that threshold of doing something ethical or unethical. The shatterproof falsehood, the belief that actions on a computer cause minimal harm regardless of that action. And it's quite the opposite, actually. Actions taken on a computer can have exponentially powerful reactions based on the actions that are taken. There can be an avalanche effect, if you will. You take one action on a computer, and that can cause significant damage or significant harm on the output. The candy from a baby falsehood. Actions that are easy to perform on a computer does not mean just because you can do it that it's necessarily legal or it's ethical, right? I can download Kali Linux and use the tools within Kali Linux to perform legitimate security functions, or I can use those tools to do negative and harmful things. And they're relatively easy tools to use, not very difficult. That doesn't mean that what I'm doing is legal or ethical. The hacker falsehood. Motivations to learn and not gain profit are often not ethical or legal. So an individual might be acting or taking an action based on a personal belief that action is righteous and good, based on what their standards are or based on what their beliefs are. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, generally speaking, that would be considered legal or ethical. The free information falsehood. Information should, and copying and, we're missing a few words there. Copying and distributing data is ethical and legal. That should say information should be available and free. The internet has always kind of been one of those areas where many individuals think that if it's on the internet, it should be free, or if it's software that's being developed by a company, that it should be made free to the public so that everybody has access to information. There was a big push in the 80s and the 90s where everybody was saying, well, Windows should be free, or Microsoft Office should be free. Microsoft shouldn't be making billions of dollars off of selling the product that they created. Everybody should have access. And so we had a push for different platforms that, Linux-based platforms and open source platforms that made computing applications and resources free to the public. So that is the free information falsehood. Okay. Of course, we understand in general what hacking and hacktivism is. Hacking is kind of a legacy term, if you will, to describe the use of computer or computing resources to perform an action that would not normally be considered, a day-to-day function. Breaking into a bank, or breaking into school records to change your grades or whatnot, or defacing a public website because you don't agree with that particular company's viewpoints or their position in the community and so on. That would be hacktivism, right? The Anonymous tends to operate this way. They're not an organization necessarily that does nefarious things with computers just to be annoying. They typically take a political stance, or at least some sort of social stance, to justify the actions that they take against the community. And they will openly state, you're not safe, we don't agree with you, we don't like who you are, and these are the reasons, and for that reason we're going to try to diminish your capacity for computing, or we're going to do some other thing to you that you might not enjoy. All right, that is hacktivism in a nutshell. The hacker promotes individuals over corporate authority and free market exchange of information. That's always kind of been the the flag that they fly, right? The use of technology to promote a political agenda or some sort of social change. The hacker culture or hacker ethics means that the ends are often related to something along the lines of free speech, human rights, freedom of information movement or data flow, freedom of access to information, and so on. All right. Hacktivists' activities span many political ideals and issues. Anonymous, WikiLeaks, LulzSec, these are examples of organizations that operate as hacktivist organizations. So that is by definition what hacktivism is. And the reason we bring it up in this section here is because it has to do with ethics, right? Even though a typical individual might look at actions that Anonymous is taking or actions that these different organizations take and look at that and say, well, that's not normal behavior, or that's not considered to be ethical behavior. But we're looking at it from a different lens and from a different perspective. Ethics codes of conduct or ethics resources. Organizations adopt internally codes of ethics that define information handling practices. It might extend beyond that as well, by the way, not just information handling practices, but it also extends to how you represent the organization or individuals within the organization on social media, how you effectively represent yourself in the public, and so on. There are, particularly in situations where contracts are involved and contract positions, which are temporary, there are guidelines or stipulations within the contract that we can terminate that individual for ethical violations, what we determine to be ethical violations. And oftentimes the verbiage for those types of provisions within a contract are pretty generic, right? Oftentimes people get fired, particularly people like whistleblowers or people that are a nuisance to the corporation or tend to speak poorly about the corporation or the corporation's actions in the public. They will be fired for, almost always some sort of ethical violation, because ethics are, subject to interpretation. It's not a law. It's not a criminal activity. It is just a way that you're supposed to behave, essentially. The Code of Fair Information Practices. No personal data record-keeping system in existence should be secret. In other words, everybody should know that their information is being collected. Individuals know information about them exists, so I would know that information is being captured about me and that it exists and how it's used. Individuals should have a way to correct false or inaccurate information. Organizations with personally identifiable information must assure reliability of data for its intended use and prevent data misuse, and people must have a way to prevent its misuse. That means that I am the owner of this information. I have control. Okay. The Internet Architecture Board, RFC 1087. RFC is what we call a request for comment. Requests for comments are just documents that are written that define standards, define protocols, define communication standards, etc. RFC stands for request for comment. And these are managed and housed with the IETF. And these are essentially publications that are widely accepted as the standard for whatever the publication describes. In this particular case, RFC 1087 defines unethical and unacceptable activities related to computer use. It states briefly, gains of unauthorized access to internet resources are unacceptable. Disrupt any intent to disrupt the use of the internet is considered unacceptable. Wastes, if you waste resources of people, of capacity, or computers, that would be considered unacceptable activity. Destroying the integrity of computer-based information and compromising privacy of individuals, all considered to be unethical. Okay? All right. The Computer Ethics Institute published the 10 Commandments. The CEI is a organization that published what we call the 10 Commandments of Ethics. Was created in the early 90s, I think, it was based on a paper that was published called In Pursuit of the 10 Commandments for Computer Ethics. And it was to set a set of standards to instruct individuals on the ethical use of computers. And you have to think about this. This was developed in the early 90s when computers were becoming much more mainstream. It wasn't really until the mid-90s, 1995, 96, that computers became truly mainstream, but certainly in corporate environments and to certain individuals, computers were available in the late 80s and the early 90s. These commandments have been documented and quoted in a lot of different documents. In fact, ISC squared is considered, I guess, a thought leader in information security. Referenced these commandments when they developed their own ethical rules, which we're going to see in this section here, and you'll see a lot of similarities. So what are those 10 commandments? Thou shalt not use a computer to harm other people. Thou shalt not interfere with other people's computer work. Thou shalt not snoop around in other people's computer files. Thou shalt not use a computer to steal. Thou shalt not use a computer to bear false witness. Thou shalt not copy or use proprietary software for which you have not paid without permission. Okay? Thou shalt not use other people's computer resources without authorization or proper compensation. Thou shalt not appropriate other people's intellectual property, or specifically intellectual output. Thou shalt, all right, so we got the last two here. Think about the social consequences of the program that you're writing or the system that you are designing. And thou shalt always use a computer in ways that ensures consideration and respect for other humans. All right? So in essence, don't use computers in ways that could harm other people. Don't use computer technology to cause interference to other people's work. Don't spy on another person. Don't use computer technology to steal stuff. Don't contribute to the spread of misinformation using computer technology. That's kind of an interesting one if you think about it. That's the bear false witness one, right? Yeah, that's a really hot topic right now. Don't misinformation and disinformation. whether you agree with the definition of what that is or not. It is definitely a hot topic right now. Don't copy software or don't buy pirated copies of software. Pay for it unless it's free. Don't use someone else's computer resources unless you're supposed to or unless you've been approved to. It is wrong to claim ownership on a work that someone else created. Think about if you're going to develop an application, you're going to develop a social media platform, you're going to develop a software application, think about the impact that's going to have on society. And of course, you want to make sure you have a positive impact, not a negative impact. Be respectful and courteous to other computing members and so on. So it kind of makes sense, logically speaking. You're not going to have to know these commandments for the exam, but they do make sense. So going to the ISC squared code of professional ethics, this is essentially what you guys have to agree to if you're going to become an ISC squared member, and certainly ISC squared certified. And it's kind of the same information, if you will. I'm not going to read the details of all of this, but you get the idea on the highlighted parts. Protect society, common good. It's necessary to establish public trust and confidence and infrastructure. So public trust in information systems, information security should be a priority. Strengthen the integrity of public infrastructure. And so on. Act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibly, and legally. Provide diligent and competent services to principals, preserving the values of systems, applications, and information. Avoid conflicts of interest, and only render services which you are competent and qualified. Advance the protection of the profession. Sponsor only qualified individuals, right? When you guys go and take your exam and you get certified, or you pass your exam and you have to come back to me and say, hey, will you sponsor me? I, of course, will be happy to do so because I understand what you guys have gone through to get to this point. But, some people might say, well, I'll sponsor you even though I know you don't meet the qualifications. Avoid association whose practices diminish the profession. Don't injure your reputation or reputation of other professionals, and maintain your skills, right? The ethical basis for IT decisions, another kind of publication, if you will, or guideline for ethical response. Golden rule: treat others as if you wish to be treated, and do not implement systems you would not use for yourself. Kant's categorical imperative: an action that's not right for one person should not be right for anybody. Descartes' rule of change: the slippery slope. Actions not repeatable at all times are not right at any time. From an ethical standpoint, I guess, not from a technological standpoint. The utilitarian principle, universalism: take action to achieve the most good and put value on the outcomes of those actions, devaluing, of course, the other actions that don't provide the most good. Risk aversion principle: incur the least amount of harm or cost when alternatives have varying degrees of harm and gain. So if you have to do something that is going to cause harm or has the potential to cause harm, choose the action that would do the least amount of damage. Avoid harm. You have a protective obligation to protect customers and clients from systems with known harm. If you, for example, know that one of your publicly facing servers is compromised and has a malware installed and is acting as a distributor of malware, you have an obligation to protect the public from that system. The no free lunch rule. Assume all information belongs to somebody. Legalism. Is it against the law? And I've talked about this a couple of times already. Moral actions may not be legal. Actually, I kind of talked about it on the flip side, right? Immoral or unethical actions may not be illegal, but they also may be considered unethical. Well, it could go the other way as well. Just because you're doing something morally or generally morally accepted, right? Defacing the website of a sex offender, a personal website of a sex offender. Most people would probably say, well, yeah, I don't have a problem with that. But even that individual, however reprehensible they may be, has certain rights, and they're protected under the law. So just because you think that you can do something because the general consensus is publicly that it's acceptable doesn't mean it's necessarily legal. All right? Professionalism. Are the actions that you're taking contrary to a code of ethics? All right. Also, evidentiary guidance. Hard data to support or deny the value of, is there hard data to support or deny the value of taking an action, right? That would be, evidentiary guidance would be something like an acceptable use policy or an employee handbook that says employees are responsible for acting in a certain manner. Client/customer/patient choice. Let people affected decide as data owners how that information is handled. They have a right to self-determination. All right? Even though they are acting as your client or they are your customer or they are your patient, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have any rights with their information. Equity. Are costs and benefits equitably distributed? Similar persons should have access to the same data and the same systems. I was talking about the internet before in relation to that. Competition. Consumers can select among competing companies based on considerations of privacy, cost, and quality. You should not be subjugated to only using one company. You should be able to have, particularly when it comes to public internet consumption and data consumption, you should have options and choices. We tend to take that for granted in this country, the United States, because we do have autonomy in choosing, for the most part, in our daily lives, choosing a particular organization or company for our transactions. Compassion/last chance. Assist the most vulnerable parties and refuse to take unfair advantage of users that do not have technical knowledge. I mean, that is probably one aspect of these ethical basis for IT decisions that, if it was applied universally, would eliminate a lot of cybercrime. Because most cybercrime today and most cyber criminals today try to affect or to enact their criminal activity based on this concept. They're taking advantage of individuals that have little or no technical knowledge. And they, you've got a virus, or your computer is part of a botnet, or, we'll throw out a bunch of technical terms to an 85-year-old grandma that barely knows how to turn a computer on, and that will effectively scare that individual into thinking that this is a legitimate concern, and she'll give you access to the computer, or he will, and so on. We see this all the time. Social manipulation and social engineering attacks. Impartiality/objectivity. Decisions not made in the favor of one group or another, and IT professionals should avoid conflicts of interest. So do not make decisions on how you behave or how you interact with individuals based on their position or their title or whatever you may want to call it. Openness and full disclosure. Persons affected by systems need to be aware of the existence of those systems, of how data is collected, and how is the data being used. When you, for example, go online and fill out an application, there are obligations of an organization that is collecting that information to identify to the users how that information is being used. And individuals are protected from misuse of that information. Oftentimes, that's going to be defined in the terms and conditions section of the site, or even with a checkbox at the end of the application with the conditions of that application. Confidentiality. Data must be protected to avoid disclosure. Data must be protected to avoid disclosure. That's pretty self-explanatory. Trustworthiness and honesty. IT professionals should stand behind ethical principles and be accountable. All right? All right. I mean, I know that a lot of these things make sense. This is part of the CBK, though. It's what we have to understand. The CISSP and the application of the Code of Ethics. Professional ethical codes are contracts between professionals. You have to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the systems that you are responsible for. All right, as an information security officer, that's what your responsibility is. The Code of Ethics are considered a contract between professionals, and they are governed by the community of information security professionals. There are 5 ethical principles that apply to processing data. Again, all 5 of these things are common sense, right? Make sure people that are affected by the decisions are aware of what decisions are being made. Consider the option and select the one that will cause the least harm. If you have to choose between multiple options that will all cause harm. Actions taken on a small scale could result in great harm if executed on a large scale. That in essence would mean that you shouldn't take that action regardless. You can't justify taking an action on a small scale if you know that that same action would be detrimental, highly detrimental, if it was taken or enacted on a large scale. Owners, conservation of ownership. Persons responsible for information always ensure the information is reasonably protected. That would be the custodian of information. We'll talk about data custodian and data user and data owner a little bit later on. The user's conservation of ownership. Always assume that others own information, and the owner's interest must be protected unless explicitly authorized. I don't think that you would ever see a situation where somebody's going to explicitly authorize lack of protection. But what they're saying is, authorized use. All right.